Hello and welcome. I'm Glenn Torres-Spelliscy, your professor, and this is the International Policy Lecture Series. Thanks for joining me. The topic this week is going to be a discussion of the Arab Spring and U.S. policy towards the region over the last decade. The regional uprisings originated as the product of protest in a small nation called Tunisia. In December of 2010, in an act of economic desperation, a young Tunisian man named Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire to protest the police seizure of his small vegetable cart. The protest was really about corruption and the lack of economic opportunity for individuals in Bouazizi's position. His act of protest would ignite a wave of uprisings across the Arab world calling for reforms. And although the uprisings began in the spring of 2011, which is why it's referred to as the Arab Spring, its origins are much older, and its consequences continue to this day. Largely it's about economic hardship, it's about corruption, it's a lot about the lack of representation, and indeed it is a largely youth-driven process. The stagnation of economic prospects for youth in the region is the worst we've seen in decades. From a practical standpoint, it was very effective, at first. The world watched as long-ruling dictators in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen were forced to step down through either a series of peaceful protests, or in some cases, violent armed rebellions. In many countries, the battle still rages on. For example, in Syria, the armed rebellion has continued for nearly a decade, with hundreds of thousands of casualties, so many that the UN stopped counting. Only now is the battle starting to wind down, with autocratic leader Bashar al-Assad maintaining his hold on power despite the 10 years of rebellion. So what is the U.S. doing about this? What's the U.S. policy? Well, many of the regimes facing these domestic challenges were actually U.S. allies. Indeed, in some cases, the U.S. had a substantial military presence within the country itself. That would seem to lead towards supporting the continued role of the autocratic regimes. But on the other hand, the U.S. has always had a substantial interest in democracy promotion, maybe more so now than at any time in the past. The reason is simple. History has shown that conflicts between democracies rarely turn violent. So the more democracies you have, so the theory goes, the more peaceful international relations will be. But the problem with revolutions, even ones that tend to install democracies, is that they are inherently unstable. What happens after a revolution is that power vacuums are created as the old power structure is dismantled and destroyed, and they need to be replaced with something. Unfortunately, they're often replaced by undesirable parties, and as a result, revolutions often fail to live up to their ideals. Indeed, the most important question that the United States could possibly ask is, what comes in the wake of these revolutions? For young democracies, the answer is not always good, particularly in the short term. But just because the answer is not always good in the short term, it doesn't mean that the democratic revolution was a bad idea. It might be that there will be additional policy challenges involved in trying to get that nation into a more democratic setting. So, the U.S. is faced with a dilemma in the Arab Spring. Should we continue our support of democratic ideas, even in the face of potential instability, or perhaps even outright hostility in the aftermath of the revolutions? Or should we continue to support autocratic rule in the region, particularly with respect to our allies, while pressuring for meaningful reforms in a bid to promote stability in an already volatile yet strategically significant region? Now, what did the U.S. actually do? Well, the U.S. adopted an approach that would vary depending on each country. In Libya, the U.S. provided logistical and air support to a NATO-led operation that was intended to support the rebels and eventually led to the ouster of former dictator Muammar Gaddafi. In Egypt, the U.S. refused to intervene to protect its longtime ally Hosni Mubarak, and eventually President Obama called on him to step down. In Syria, on the other hand, despite many calls for U.S. intervention, U.S. administrations have refused to provide military aid to rebel movements, for a variety of reasons, one of which is that they have far too many associations with extremist parties. As a result, the autocratic regime of Bashar al-Assad has been able to stand the decade-long rebellion against his rule. Still, in other places like Jordan, the U.S. has supported reform policies put in place by their autocratic allies. These provide some political reforms while maintaining the current ruling structure. And in still other places, security concerns have prevailed over thoughts of freedom and democracy, and the U.S. has continued to support autocratic regimes in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, despite the violent and often bloody repression of nascent democratic movements. Now, many critics have argued that all these different approaches are demonstrable of the fact that the U.S. doesn't have a coherent policy towards the Arab Spring, that the U.S. is kind of lurching between various crises and is losing influence in the region. These critics claim that the declining levels of U.S. influence are best illustrated by the rise of powerful anti-U.S. voices in places like Egypt, and violence against the U.S. and its interests, as evidenced by the attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya, a place where we had actually supported reformers, as well as the 2019 attacks on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Supporters, on the other hand, argue that this nuanced approach to policy in the Middle East is entirely appropriate and reflects a deep understanding of the various conflicts in the region and the different histories that each of the nations have. The main question that the U.S. faces from a policy perspective is whether it should continue to adopt that nuanced approach, looking at each situation and carefully measuring the potential benefits of costs of action in a particular country, sometimes siding with dictators and autocrats, and sometimes adopting an approach that favors a set of democratic ideals, regardless of the consequences, in the belief that a freer world is a more prosperous world. The Biden administration has made the stabilization of democratic regimes around the world a top priority in its foreign policy. Indeed, in February 2021, Biden stated,
"So let me be very straightforward with you all. We are in the midst of a fundamental debate about the future and direction of our world. We're at an inflection point. Between those who argue that given all the challenges we face, from the fourth industrial revolution to the global pandemic, that autocracy is the best way forward, they argue. And those who understand that democracy is essential to meeting these challenges. Historians are going to examine and write about this moment as an inflection point, as I said. And I believe that every ounce of my being that democracy will and must prevail. We must demonstrate that democracy can still deliver for our people in this changed world. That, in my view, is our galvanizing mission. Democracy doesn't happen by accident. We have to defend it, fight for it, strengthen it, renew it. We have to prove that our model isn't a relic of history. It's the single best way to revitalize the promise of our future. And if we work together with our democratic partners with strength and confidence, I know we'll meet every challenge and outpace every challenger.
In December 2021, the United States hosted a virtual summit for democracy, which brought together leaders from democracies across the globe. That said, the Biden administration has not withdrawn support for autocratic allies like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. And although it has limited weapon sales to Saudi Arabia over its conflict in Yemen. Indeed, the democratic revolutions that swept through the Middle East and North Africa have largely faded from view, and those new regimes have largely been replaced by even newer autocratic regimes. The lack of success demonstrates the difficulty of establishing effective democratic institutions in short order, particularly in places with a history of political and economic corruption. So with that, go on to read the lecture and the readings for this week, and I will see you on the discussion boards.